This presentation will examine the interrelationship between energy, entropy, and urbanization. And we're going to start by thinking about what urbanization actually means. Generally, when people use that term, they're referring to the demographic view, and that is expressed in this paraphrasing of Tisdale, who claims that it's large population size and high density, and she says the rate of urban population growth exceeds that of rural population growth. So that's when we've got urbanization. And it's important to note here that because that's a relative rate, difference of rates, that it could be that rural areas are growing at the same time that urbanization is taking place. There are other ways of thinking about urbanization. The social change view is expressed by Charles Tilly, who says that it has to do with a shift from local, small-scale, and homogeneous activities to expansive, large-scale places with differentiated institutions and coordinated activities. And so this has more to do with maybe the economy, the scale of life, the kinds of activities going on in a particular place, and that is not captured in the demographic view. And finally, the cultural view. This is really kind of a new way of thinking about things, and we have coined a term, Alex Thomas and I, called urban normativity, which has to do with this notion of our cultural values and beliefs coming to view urban life as the normal state of affairs and rural life as the kind of aberration or deviant kind of lifestyle in a way. And it doesn't necessarily mean that people look down on rural life. Many times they actually may romanticize rural life or cast it in sort of idyllic, charming terms. But even when we do that, it's still being portrayed as something that's abnormal, just in a good way. So this notion of cultural urbanization coincides with a rising tide of urban normativity. When we look at sort of the history of the United States in terms of the growth of cities and urban populations, here we're using primarily a demographic viewpoint, although the other types tend to coincide with the demographic changes. And if we think of the birth of the United States, 1776 era, only about 5% of the population was actually living in an urban area, and at that time, the size of Philadelphia was roughly 42,000 people, which is today the size of what we would call a micropolitan area. So it's not even a city by many standards that the census uses. So westward expansion by 1860, leading up to the Civil War, about a fifth of the population had moved to a city, an urban area. And at that time, and before that, of course, cities were not what we think of today. For one thing, there were a lot of animals loose. There were not always good systems of infrastructure in place, so raw sewage could be found. In a lot of places, there were no waste disposal systems in place, so people just throw their trash all over the place. And so, to a large degree, the cities were dirty and dangerous and a breeding ground for disease. By 1950, the population of the United States was primarily urban, and by the time that happened, we started seeing some deconcentration. A period of suburbanization followed, particularly after World War II, and the FHA, Federal Housing Administration, and guaranteed mortgages. All these inventions really helped facilitate the movement to suburbs. And at that time, the city centers began to decline. But even so, with this deconcentration, I think it's still, if we look at the large picture, suburbs are really part of the metro area, the urban area. And so that's still a continued period of urbanization, although the shape of urbanization was now looking more like a donut than the central business district model of the human ecology school that we mentioned. So now, over 80% of the United States is living in an urban area, and it's predicted to go as high as 90%, and may never reach 100. There's a lot of land in the United States. There are a lot of jobs that are necessarily going to be located in rural areas, but a good chunk of people live in cities, so clearly that is that is the preference, at least behaviorally. Although ironically and paradoxically, many people express a desire to live in a smaller town. And I think that's why many suburbs try to emulate small town life. So this is an interesting question. Is this process of urbanization linear? That is, does it just go from less urban to more urban, and that's the end of the story? And, we do see some what we call turnarounds in the United States, or rebounds, rural rebound. But by and large, the overall pattern has been towards urbanization. And if you look at the global scale, and that's what we're going to be turning our attention to next, it does look fairly urban, that we've been on a steady march towards becoming an urban planet. And in fact, recently, around 2008, 2010, somewhere in there, the planet became predominantly urban. When we compare wealthy countries to poor countries, we see that the vast majority of people in wealthy countries tend to be in urban areas. In fact, on average, about 75% of people in wealthy countries, while in poor countries, only about a third of the population lives in a city or urban area. But these places that have a high rural population are also the places where we see the most rapid rates of urbanization. So this process appears to be unfolding almost universally across the globe. It makes you wonder, do people ever stop and want to think, is this really a good idea, piling millions of people into a very small area, creating this kind of fragile dependence on distant lands? And that's something that I think we're going to have to pay attention to. And so, as we look at the map, we see the blue countries in here are the predominantly urban places. The green are the most rural, and you see Asia and Africa standing out here, parts of Oceania maybe, such as Papua New Guinea. And the moderately urbanized places are located nearby the primarily rural places. And almost the entire Western Hemisphere is urbanized. Nearly all of, well, most of Europe, I guess Eastern Europe, pretty much all of Europe is urbanized to a more or less degree, and Asia is going in that direction pretty quickly. Africa will be the last to get there, but it appears to be moving in the same direction. So let's think about the implications of this in terms of energy and entropy. And a lot of times you'll hear that the real hope of sustainability is to pile people into cities, and I've always found that to be an odd kind of proposition, and so we'll explore that a little bit. I think it's helpful here, when we're about to talk about entropy, to think about what that term means, and that means we have to think about the laws of thermodynamics. And essentially there are two laws. The first is the quantity of matter and energy in the universe is fixed, neither created nor destroyed, only transformed. And the second law is that the quality of matter and energy is diminished each time they are transformed. So while these are kind of abstract laws, the way that these translate into something that is meaningful to us is that, the more people there are, the more energy we're using. The more energy we're using, the more we're creating entropy. All right, so we're degrading the quality of matter and energy over time, the more we use it and transform it. And when humans, for example, eat food, they're transforming energy from one form to another, and that's creating a form of entropy. And I think that's a useful way to think about waste and byproduct, which of course is going to have an impact on the environment. Now, the quality of the environment is literally diminished. The energy in the environment is being transformed and lost to thermal heat, which is the most degraded form of energy. So when matter is transformed, there's a little bit more disorganization introduced to the universe. We're going to talk about this in the literal sense and the perhaps metaphorical sense in terms of environmental and social entropy. Environmental entropy, of course, is what we were just talking about, degradation of the quality of matter and energy in the environment, and social entropy has more to do with the degradation of societal and cultural functioning. But I think those two things are closely interrelated. When our environment becomes degraded, our ability to have a robust economy, our ability to enjoy the environment, to live healthy, safe lives, is also diminished. This is an interesting idea expressed by Rees and Moore in Vail 2013. They say urbanization merely separates people spatially from their supportive ecosystems without changing their functional dependence on those systems. In other words, urbanization effectively divides the human ecosystem into two distinct physical components: a widely dispersed, productive hinterland, and a densely concentrated but wholly dependent consumptive core, the city itself. And I think that spells out how urbanization is going to be featured in this discussion of entropy and energy loss, because unfortunately when you live in an environment that's cut off from the source of energy, you don't actually see the consequences of your consumption. And that creates an unsafe and unrealistic notion that maybe there's an endless supply, an infinite supply of energy that's being piped in, and that the byproduct of that energy is really minimal and trivial, and that's only because you're simply not seeing it. And that creates a kind of cultural problem, cultural lack of awareness. Perhaps that is related to the human exemptionalist paradigm, as noted by Dunlap and Catton. More and more people living in these cities having less and less awareness of the impact of their consumption and their footprints. So with urbanization and entropy, we can note that the pace of resource throughput is increased by the activity required to support large urban populations. Throughput is simply the conversion of energy. Remember, taking one form of energy, converting it into another. And the distance required to capture resources is only increasing because urban populations, with the view that there's unlimited resources, can continue to swell to even larger and more unsustainable sizes, creating a very, very fragile and vulnerable state of urban dependency on rural resources. And it's just, it wouldn't take much to disrupt the flow, and that is why we have some concerns about urbanization. It's a pretty risky business in a lot of respects. So how do we measure this? And again, the footprint we've mentioned before when we were talking about the carrying capacity. Now we're going to think about the carrying capacity not only in terms of availability of resources, but also in terms of the absorptive capacity of the environment, and that has to do with entropy and energy loss. So the footprint, as you recall, is a measure that refers to the amount of land area required to support consumption patterns for a given country, and that means providing resources and absorbing the byproducts of consumption. So biocapacity is a term that refers to the natural resources that are used to support people. So the extent to which the environment can support population is the extent of their biocapacity. So we can think of entropy then as our biocapacity minus our ecological footprint. So the total sort of bank account of natural resources minus the total consumption of those resources and byproducts. This table comes from McKinney, 2014, where she looks at entropy in rural populations. And as you look across the top of the table, you can see that the ecological footprint of the world has held somewhere between 2.4 and 3, which can be essentially translated to mean the amount of consumption that's taking place would require about 2.5 to 3 planets. So we're really living well over what the Earth can provide. And if we look at biocapacity, we've been losing it. The Earth was once very abundant in energy supplies. The average biocapacity about 3.7, diminishing down to 1.8. And so the ratio of footprint to biocapacity has been increasing, right? That's not a good thing. We don't want to have biocapacity being exceeded. This is a good measure of overshoot, right? So the percent rural during all this, of course, has been declining. As we've urbanized, we've consumed more, and we've lost greater biocapacity. So this notion that increased urbanization is the pathway to sustainability is called into question looking at these data. When we look at income in rural population, we see that the case is really those high-income countries, which, as we earlier noted, are the more urbanized countries. They have the lowest percent rural, right? High-income countries, only 23% rural on average. And their overshoot measure, which we could call entropic disorder following McKinney's lead, is -3. So there's a total almost 2-to-1 overshoot there. Low-income countries are about even. They're about breaking even. So they're primarily rural, 73%. And so it would seem that the more sustainable countries are those that are the most rural, and unfortunately the most poor. But what is poverty but a measure of economic activity? And in a lot of cases, rural places have less economic activity because they have more non-market forms of supporting themselves, such as subsistence farming. All right, but it creates an interesting question when we're thinking about going through the process of development. What should we be thinking about? Is it really such a good idea for people to continue piling into urban areas? And is that even possible for the remaining rural countries? So finally, when we look at urbanization entropy, we can conclude that many nations and regions in the world have experienced advanced levels of urbanization, and those same places are in extreme ecological overshoot as measured by entropic disorder. And we can also observe as Daly notes that the amount of land area required to support even a small physical urban area is about 1,000 times greater to supply the kinds of resources necessary. So is it possible or even desirable to maybe de-urbanize? And that's a conversation you don't often hear, and that's, it is a logical possibility, but it's something that requires some careful conversation and thought, and we don't really have the answer for you on that today, but we certainly raise the possibility and certainly think it's worthy of some consideration and discussion. If you'd like to see more information about urbanization on a global scale or of the ecological footprint, here are a couple of useful websites: thefootprintnetwork.org and the UN's website on population. And just these things change sometimes, so if it doesn't, notorious is the United Nations, they often rearrange their website. If that's not the same, then simply Google United Nations population and you'll find it. Thanks for watching.